Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad that you are here, and such a large amount of people. Call it a world where digital comes first. Call it a VUCA world, or call it the fourth industrial revolution. We all live in a world where technology has a huge impact on our daily lives. This leads to several challenges and, of course, also opportunities that we have to deal with and that we can use. Are we prepared enough for this? Will adults of tomorrow be prepared to deal with these challenges and opportunities? Should this have impact on key attributions for tomorrow's adults? And what are the consequences for education, and especially higher education? This, ladies and gentlemen, is the theme of this Spotlight Stage session. My name is Wilfred Rubens, and it's my honor to chair this session. And it's my pleasure also to introduce to you David White. David is Head of Digital Learning at the University of Arts in London. Welcome, David. Thank you. And of course, I would like to welcome Marc Prensky, founder and Executive Director of the Global Future Education Foundation and Institute. Glad to have you here, Marc. Also one of the winners of the debate of yesterday evening. What we are going to do, congratulations with that, Marc. What we are going to do today is to discuss several questions around this theme I just introduced. First, I will ask David and Marc to reflect on the questions I will ask them, and then I will return to you, the audience, to collect contributions. We have a catch box that we will use for that purpose. And of course, Marc and Dave will respond to your contributions as well. So the first question is that in the introduction of this session, it is suggested that there are key attributes successful students need to thrive in a world where digital comes first. Do you think, for example, to start with you, Marc, are there any key personal or educational attributes relative to technology that all tomorrow adults require? What do you think?
I think that I like to think of what people need to succeed, to be successful, in four categories. One is effective thinking, one is effective action, one is effective relationships, and the last is effective accomplishment. And one of the things that's happened in education is that academic education has divorced the thinking portion from education, and the traditional accomplishment education has gone into our businesses. So that the thinking portion is in the schools and thinking only, and therefore kids come out of 20 years of school, they get into a profession or a business, and they have to start at the very bottom because nobody's taught them to get anything done, how to do things. In addition to that, and everybody has a different profile, but those are the four categories. In addition to that, what I think technology is forcing on us is the need to be unique. To say, if two people can do something, and Julia just repeated this in the last session, a machine can do it. So what everybody needs to try to find at their own level is how to be better and different than something that a machine might do, and therefore I choose you over the machine. And so I think that's very different than how we were preparing people in the past. We were preparing them to be equal and competitive, or to be more or less competitive on the same criteria. Now we're preparing them to be as individual as possible.
Okay.
And yet to still be able to work in teams.
Yeah, okay. Dave?
Okay, I'm already interested in what you're saying there, because you use the word effective a lot. And for me, it's like, who's deciding what effective means in those? Okay. But my answer to the question would be, especially with the digital, is respect. I think that's a key one. You see a lot of polarization. The digital allows us to find people who think exactly the same way we do. Causes kind of homophily, kind of these little areas of groupthink. And I think what we see online is sometimes you see tolerance, but you don't necessarily see respect. So I think respect is something that's really, really important, which has sort of fallen out of the system. So I might be generous enough to tolerate somebody having a voice that I don't agree with, but do I actually respect them?
Yeah.
The other one, yeah.
Oh, go ahead, please. I don't.
Okay. The willingness to expand or extend your worldview. I mean, certainly in higher education, I think if our students left with the same sized worldview that they arrived, I don't think we've done our jobs. Yeah. The ability to connect across boundaries as well, which sort of speaks to that first point about respect. And then the last one, which is a slightly arts way of looking at things, I've got positive in brackets and then criticality. So in the science world, criticality is the moment when a nuclear reaction goes critical. That's not what I mean, because that's apocalyptic. It just obviously means having a kind of an overall critical mindset towards things, but in a positive way.
Yeah. Okay.
And I was going to add that my colleague, Esther Wojcicki, who's a teacher, has this wonderful acronym called TRIC, okay, which is trust, respect, independence, collaboration, kindness. And that's her secret sauce for dealing with kids, and it works very well, and I've watched her do it. And it's amazing when I go around the world to talk to kids how little respect they get, and how often they tell me, we don't get enough respect, we're not trusted enough, and people are not kind enough to us. So I agree with you.
Okay. And what do you think, Dave, about the distinction that Marc made between the thinking and the accomplishments? Because you work for an institute of education. Do you recognize this?
No, I don't. Well, not in my institution. I mean, I'm proud to say my institution is geared. I mean, one of the nice things about creative arts is that it's all about questions, it's all about thinking, and the work is an expression of that. Otherwise, the work's just hollow. It's just pretty things. So I don't think it's as divorced as you're making out necessarily. I think that a lot of higher education is teaching students how to think. Now, sometimes the curriculum is so full, there's not enough space for that because there's just a ton of stuff that you need to get into your head. And I think that's a problem. I think we need more space in the curriculum to have time to reflect and to develop the ability to think.
Yeah.
And my perspective, the thing that I try to make a contrast between is accomplishment and achievement.
Okay.
And so achievement is doing well in the system, getting scores, climbing a mountain perhaps because it's there, because you want to, and something you do for you that's a personal, that reflects on you personally.
Okay.
An accomplishment, in my use of the term, is something that affects the world and that makes the world better. So if you have done this phenomenal work of art and it hangs in a closet, that might be an achievement. Even maybe it won a prize and it does. But if it gets in a museum, or it affects somebody, or it affects the world, or it makes a statement that somehow, that's the kind of accomplishment that I look for from schools. And I think that our schools have failed to a large extent in helping kids accomplish. Kids achieve pretty well in our system, but often, and this may be different in the arts, so I definitely take that. But we don't teach our kids to accomplish things that make their world a better place. And I think we could.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the audience. Who wants to reflect on the contributions of David or Marc? Who wants to add maybe some key attributions that they have not mentioned here?
Is it too contentious a subject?
No, what's great is we have no facts, so we can't be factually wrong. Huh. Right?
Okay.
These are opinions.
These indeed are opinions. Everybody, okay. Then I suggest we go to the next question. and it will be, I guess, more concrete maybe than the first, which was a little bit more abstract. What is also said that today, today that people and that that people should have more or less digital learning skills, or learning skills to deal with the digital world and the challenges that they face with it. Do you think that these digital learning skills exist in a meaningful way? And is it maybe possible that you define digital learning skills?
You want to go?
Maybe
yeah,
David
okay.
first?
Well, I think that, okay, so we talk about the digital. I think that there are definitely some things that have come along because of the web that we need to consider. And I think sometimes the education system struggles to consider these things. There are two really big ones for me, okay? One is the abundance of information, okay? So it's not that long ago, well, certainly when I went to university, which is quite a long time ago, that, you know, your area of study was about that much of a shelf in the library, okay? And now there's an abundance of information, and so we have to teach how to deal with that abundance, how to negotiate that abundance. And that information comes in various kinds of forms. And we're still very tied to sort of to genres of information. So we still like the idea of the book, okay? And by the way, I'm unusual in educa terms because I haven't written a book. So that makes me kind of an odd one out in that sense.
But you've read a few.
I've read a few, yeah. So we like the idea of a book, we like the idea of a journal. Students learn an awful lot from less traditional sources, things like YouTube, but I think they still feel like they can't necessarily cite those things. They learn a lot from Wikipedia, they still feel like they can't cite those things. So what happens is you create a kind of learning black market whereby the places that students are going to actually, where they go to learn, they won't tell us about because we haven't had that conversation with them. And I think that's a problem. Because it means we can't have a conversation about how to negotiate that. And I think the other thing, and it always surprises me that we don't talk about this more, is that with the web, anyone can publish whatever you think publishing might be. And sometimes we forget what a huge big deal that is. It's massive. Anyone can publish, and what it means is that in educational terms, moving from that idea of kind of consuming knowledge to producing knowledge and contributing to your discipline or to your field or to your area, you can do that earlier. You don't have to wait until the last chapter of your PhD before you're allowed to say something that contributes. And I think sometimes we struggle to really make the most of that in education. So those are two areas that have emerged because of the web and the digital that we could respond to better. Now, there are plenty of people teaching that do that brilliantly. But as a system, we still find it, I don't know, whether we find it threatening or vexing or confusing, but we don't know how to handle it.
Okay. Marc?
I've been struggling for a while now with the idea of learning and that education is about learning, or the two are even close to synonymous. I don't think they are. I think that education is the process from which you get from being a little kid to an adult, and maybe beyond that the rest of your life, that learning is a means. It's not an end. So the end for me is accomplishment. The end is what you want to do, and therefore in order to get to that end, you have to learn. And learning is almost always a painful process. It's almost always a difficult process. It requires a lot of effort. It's not something that many people do just for the pleasure of it. Those people tend to be academics because they love that. Most people go through learning, whether it's in sports, whether it's in academics or a profession, because they want to get to a particular end. One of the nice things that digital does is it makes that process a lot easier, I think. Not all of it. Some of it is just going to be the same mental process that it's always been. But think of sports where you can get, use simulators, get feedback. The feedback process is very much sped up by technology, and some argue that the learning loop of doing and reflecting and making mistakes and going further is the real process by which we learn. That's been sped up enormously, I think, by technology. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, but an additional question, what you also see is, when you look at research, is that a lot of people use technology in an ineffective way. For example, there is a lot of research that shows that if you write notes, it's more effective for your learning than if you type notes. So what I also was wondering is, isn't it important to learn our students how to use these devices in a more effective way than we do right now?
But this is the problem: is the word effective.
Yeah,
because we have to decide what we think that means. Okay.
If you looked at the learning results, for example, there are examples of research that they, for example, have a group of students who write down notes and a group of students who type down notes, and they let them do the same test at the end. Of course, you can say that there are limitations in the way they test people, but there are then differences between how they perform on such a test, and there are differences between writing and typing.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't know. I'm very suspicious of all that stuff. Because when I look at that kind of research, quite often I don't see anybody clarifying what they think education is or what it's for. You know, to me, education is a process of becoming. Okay, you become, you gain attributes. It's not necessarily about picking up skills, and I think if we make it that, then that's where we get into trouble with technological change and with, jobs and robots and blah, 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 right? Most of that research is modeled against a form of education that I'm not sure I even recognize. So this is my point, is that we have these conversations about what's effective. Is this bit of technology going to be a solution? Is this going to make us more efficient? But we rarely have a conversation about what are we actually trying to achieve. And I don't entirely agree with you about the balance between achievement and what was the accomplishment. I wanted to start something called the Love of Learning Society, or LOLS for short, because I genuinely believe in learning for learning's sake. And it worries me that what happens is when we bring learning and technology together, then the net result is all of this is going to help you to get a job or help you to earn more money. That's what the discourse around this becomes. That's part of education. Absolutely. Let's not make it all of education.
Well, I'm going to suggest that there's a middle ground. That this becomes a very difficult and often sterile debate. Is it for learning for its own sake and for learning, or is it for getting jobs? And I'm going to suggest the middle ground is improving the world. Yeah. That the reason we educate and the reason we pay as a society to educate kids is that they will make their world better in some way. And so I would, and when we think about purpose, I love your word becoming, because I've used that word as well, but becoming what? And I say becoming a good, effective, world-improving person. And when I say effective, I can't define it for you, but I can contrast it with ineffective. And we're pretty good at telling when things are ineffective. Okay. So I'm happy to keep the term very loose. That's effective, and let the people who are doing it, decide what's effective or not effective. And let's make it aim to the positive, to the good, and not the evil side of life. And I think those are fairly, they're not easily hard definable, but they're pretty easily soft definable. And even world improving. I think that if you take it from the point of view of the person doing the improvement, of the person, of the young people, again, they can decide, not black and white, but in a general sense of a spectrum. Does this fall on the world improving side of the spectrum? Does this fall on the not world improving.
So do you think that Zuckerberg, that Facebook is improving the world? Because I'm sure the people that are running Facebook think it is.
Oh, I think it's absolutely improving the world. And I think it's improving the world in the sense, not in the content on Facebook, but in the sense that it's connecting the world. And the world has dreamed. I mean, science fiction writers, you can go back forever, has dreamed of this, of being connected and what will happen when we're connected and when planets and humans and stars, everything is connected. I think we're achieving a long time human dream, and then we don't know what to do with it.
Okay.
That's the big issue. What do we do with this connectivity? How do we behave as nodes on this network?
Okay. Let's focus on the question about the skills. So you both mentioned some skills. What I think what I miss in both of your contributions is that I don't hear any what you could say. Well, how can we learn students to learn? How can we invest in their metacognitive competences, which are, in my opinion, very important in every period, in every era. How do you think about that? How can we foster learning strategies, effective? Forgive me the word effective effectivity, but how can we foster learning strategies that helps students not only in qualifications but also in becoming a person and getting involved with others?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I hinted at that earlier, and it's to do with that idea of teaching how to think.
Okay.
And that becomes a response to quite a lot of things. So there's something that has been bothering me about the whole fake news idea, okay, which is that, you know, some people say we need to teach people how to think critically so they can spot fake news. The fact is, you should apply the same critical thinking to any source of information.
Yeah,
you know, it's the same job, okay?
Yeah.
And so just harking back to what I was saying earlier, if I was going to change things, if you like, in terms of higher education, I would reduce the amount of time that is spent on your specific discipline and have more time for these more broad, more fundamental skills to do with reflection, critical thinking, worldview, you know. And if I was going to teach, I want students who are coming through the system to be equipped to approach this world that we're living in, which is quite polarized and divisive, and the digital is a lot to do with that. And I want students to be equipped with a sense of identity that is robust enough, but not fixed, but robust enough to be able to not get pushed around. You know, not get pushed around by the way that the algorithms are working in the back of Facebook. Not imagine that what Google's giving them is the only information, even though it's good information. You know, so it's that kind of. It sounds old-fashioned, but I believe in it. It's a kind of depth of character, if you like. And I think what happens is we've rammed education with so much instrumental stuff, quite a lot of process, a lot about discipline, that there isn't enough time and space. A lot of higher education students, they're caregivers, they're holding down jobs, you know, because of the way the funding works. There isn't space to think.
Okay.
And I wish I had €1 for every college professor that I have ever heard say, I need to teach my students to think.
Yep.
And my answer to that is, boy, is that insulting, because every single one of your students sitting in front of you thinks. What you're telling us is, we want you to think like I want you to think. Like we think critical thinking is, and these kinds of critical thinking are important. We want you to think in this way, not in this way. And we have to be a little bit careful of that. We should do it and help them understand what we think is important. So that's the first part about thinking, but it goes way beyond thinking. Thinking, even critical thinking, even problem solving, is not enough in the world unless it's accompanied by effective action and relationships and accomplishment. Otherwise, you just sit there in your corner and you think, and we call those ivory towers. And we need a little bit of that. We need some of that. We have thinkers. We can count the major thinkers on, you know, a couple of hands in the world, and we should read them and look at them. But that's not what people need by itself. And one of the real problems in our academic system is that we focus so hard on thinking, which some people are very good at and other people are less good at. Some people are much better at doing. Some people are much better at relationships. I went to school with all these, and so did you, I'm sure, these different kinds of people. Some people are much better at getting things done. We have to have that spectrum in place. And that's what I think is really missing. I think we know how to do parts of the thinking part. We try, we talk about it, but the rest of it we do very little of.
Are you saying we should have more action, less thinking?
No.
Yes, I'm saying that thinking should not be 100%. I'm saying that thinking is a good 25% of the equation.
So I'll let you into a secret, which I wouldn't say in my institution, but if you want to get an A in my institution, and this is a vote for creative arts pedagogies, if you want to get an A, then essentially you say, I think the question you set wasn't right, and here's why. Okay, so we don't program people to think like us. We're very happy when students come back at us and say, you know what, I think you started in the wrong place. And my institution and a lot of higher education institutions are capable of doing that. And I think that's what good teaching looks like. Okay, you can't say, I'm going to teach you to think unless you disagree with me.
But excuse me, what you just said is you get the A by thinking in this particular way. If you think, if you can say, I think your assignment is bunk or whatever it is, I thought critically and I don't like it, that's the kind of thinking that's going to get you an A. So I'm training you to do that.
No, because the flavor of that could be anything. The flavor of that, I'm describing a whole territory of possibilities. The whole territory.
But by the way, in 1972, the famous Brazilian pedagogue Paulo Ferreira, he emphasized the importance of action and reflection for learning. So that's, I think both are very important to learn in a good way.
But you see, that's where I would go. You said for learning, as if learning is the goal. Learning is not the goal. Learning is the means, is one of the means, whether it's learning through thinking and reflection, whether it's learning through action.
So the goal is making the world a better place?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
How's that go?
Let's go to the audience.
The kids want to do it. It's going well.
Yeah. First, I knew, Robert Jan, that you would raise your hand. First, lady here in front, and then Robert Jan Simmons. Yes.
And you've got to put it close to your mouth.
Yes, I used this yesterday. I said we were talking about getting jobs made redundant, and you don't need people with a microphone anymore. You just throw the ball around. I think that we have to rethink teaching. Because from what I'm hearing here, teachers are seen as a font of knowledge. And because students get so much exposure to so much information and so much knowledge out there, that teachers are expert learners. You know, they've succeeded because they're expert learners. And I think it's about sharing that learning experience. And I wrote a paper about 4 years ago about the education and the Internet of Things. And I looked at the idea of students being co-researchers. So maybe doing a science experiment with digital probes and sensors and things like that, and actually getting data and feeding that data back and working with the authentic experiences with researchers, with teachers, to try and make sense of the world through experimentation. So it's action. And thinking, you know, you can't know, everyone thinks. And I think the problem here is that we're talking about people, you're talking about higher education, we're talking about the best in society who've really been successful at learning in the way that learning is positioned in most of our countries, and they've got really good at learning. And in that model, it's not about making the world a better place, which I really agree with you on. It's can I get to the next step in my learning journey? And we have to think about those students who never get to university, who fail at school. How can we help them to be better citizens? And I think seeing them as co-researchers and co-workers is one way of doing it.
Okay, thank you. Robert Jan, and then maybe another question, and then we go back to the panel.
My name is Robert Jan Simmons. I'm a bit afraid that the idea of having less special disciplinary learning and more general thinking-related learning is a false dichotomy. And because there is no, in my view, there is no thinking without content. And the message should, in my view, be that within these disciplines, thinking should be more important. And we shouldn't make a distinction between those two worlds. Yeah. It's better, in my view, better to have then the deep learning approach with critical thinking embedded in the discipline. And of course, you need time for that, so you cannot cover all the content you used to cover, but the integration is the essential thing, in my view.
Well,
okay, maybe one question and more for the lady there, and then we'll go back to you for a reflection.
He's got it all written down.
I got, yes, it's the...
There is the lady, next to Stephen Downs here in the third row, yeah.
Good try.
It may be redundant, really, from what's just been said, but isn't it fundamental in order to act responsibly in the world?
In order to access...
Sorry?
In order to access what?
No, in order to act responsibly in the world, and especially in a digital world, that you have been taught critical thinking, and that it's had a place and it's had, well, enough importance attached to it, really.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to reflect on the three contributions? First, Marc, maybe, or? Yeah?
Okay, well, let me, I certainly remember the last two, and you can remind me of yours. I agree, you need context. The disciplines are not the context we need anymore. What I advocate, especially starting from the very small ages, is for people to do real-world projects. And that becomes the context in which you can learn skills like critical thinking, you can learn particular knowledge of a subject. And the reason that works well is that when you learn, and especially if that's a project you've picked and you want to do and you want to accomplish, you're going to remember that stuff. That's when stuff sticks in your head. It's when you learn it in the context of doing something you want to do. So I agree with you about the context, but not about the disciplines. You know, it's very interesting to see how, I don't know how critical thinking, whether critical thinking is something that just isn't there unless we teach it and pass it down from generation to generation, or if there are people who actually are better critical thinkers and who grow up that way and who think that way, or if a milieu, just being surrounded by critical thinkers, like a family who does that or something like that, really inculcates that into those people. I think it's a mix. I think that we ought to have critical thinkers, and however we form them, I think it's not enough to just be a critical thinker. I think you have to apply that critical thinking to getting something accomplished in the world. But it is important. And your point here in the front was we have to change teaching. Yes, because teaching implies only some people know something, and they're going to give it to somebody else. And that is now that stuff is no longer private. It's on the internet. Everybody has access to this. You can teach yourself. And as Isaac Asimov said, I firmly believe the only kind of learning that there is self-learning, that you do it yourself because you want to do it. So we do need another term for teacher. Maybe we need to call them coaches, maybe we need to call them facilitators, maybe we need to call them something else, but it's time that we got rid of the sort of teacher-student distinction, and as you were talking about, that we think of ourselves as partners.
Yeah. Okay.
Does anybody really think that that's teaching? I don't think that that's teaching. The idea that teaching is I've got some information in my head and I'm going to put it in your head. I mean, I don't recognize that. I mean, maybe we do need a different word, but to me, teaching is about helping people in that process of becoming, and about helping people to develop techniques so that they can learn for themselves. I mean, and that's what I see happens a lot in higher education. So there's that aspect to it. I take your point about critical thinking should be in the context of the disciplines. I think sometimes it does get squeezed out because there's so much that people are trying to get through. Just coming back to the digital for a second, I mean, I think we're in danger of running on the idea that the digital environment is benign, and it's not. I mean, it has many positive aspects to it, but I always think that Google's strapline should be think less, find more. I mean, that is their business model, and sometimes that's really useful. I've spoken to students. If you ask students sometimes, what would be if you had a magic wand, what would be the perfect thing you could have to help you learn? And in various ways, most of them, not all of them, but most of them say, I want it to be Google, but I want to know the top result is correct, so that I don't have to think about it. Okay, so what we call research, what I'd call research, some students think is what you have to do because the technology doesn't work well enough yet. Okay, now that's the problem. So I think with Google it's think less, find more. I think with social media and Facebook it's think less, get told more. So this is why we have to actively equip people to be able to respond to that world. It's not benign.
Well, I agree with you that somebody needs to know that the word, the re in research means more than once. Research again, right? That's it. If nobody's ever told you that, then you're missing something. And one of the things that we do the most terrible job of, I think, in the world, is focusing students on the most important thing in any skill, in any field, in any domain. I call it the top tweet. What should you remember in 20 years? And if you think that's a critical skill, if you think that's, you know, look at more than one source, because people tend to forget. I don't know if anybody else in this room has ever seen the 5-Minute University from Father Guido Sarducci, right? Where, you know, he teaches you only what you're going to remember in 10 years. So Spanish is, you know, como está usted muy bien, period, right? Supply and demand, period. But I think, in a sense, what I hear in your comments is teachers are great. They do all this stuff. We really teach our kids to differentiate and think and do all things. I think you do that. I think if you polled teachers around the world, at any level, you would find they're mostly content providers. And in fact, not just that they are, but that's what they're told to be. And the second thing, if I can just finish the thought here, is that, you know, I think you have this negative attitude towards students, which says, you know, well, look at, they don't do this and they don't do this. And I always used to think that I would hear a teacher say, my kids can't write, or they can't read, or they can't think, or they can't do this. And I'm always waiting for the other shoe to drop, which is, until they leave my class.
Yeah.
And if that's fair, if that's what happens, okay, they come in, you know, like this, and they leave like this, then you're doing a good job.
Yeah. What I also was wondering, do you know, Marc, do you know the work of John Hattie?
Yeah.
One of his conclusions is that if you have no about subjects you don't know, you don't have a lot of knowledge about it, then instruction is better than, for example, inquiry-based learning, because the problem with inquiry-based learning, according to Hattie's research, is that he says, well, it's introduced much too early. So it's effective, but people need to know, have some basic knowledge about the subject before they can do research-based knowledge, of inquiry-based knowledge.
Yeah, that, you know, I think the whole process of being an infant in the world belies that.
Sorry?
But it belies that. What does an infant know about the world? All they do is they come into a world about which they are totally ignorant, that's totally bizarre, and they experiment and they figure it out and they do that kind of learning, and that's how they learn, and they try to make sense of things. And eventually they connect to other people and do that. I totally would disagree with that. Call it research means nothing to me. I would think he's wrong.
So your opinion, you think your opinion is more important than the research that has been done in education?
Yeah, okay, let's talk about research for a second.
Yeah?
I'm very suspicious of this thing called research, and the easiest way to put something down is to say, the research shows. Well, show me a particular study that shows a particular thing that's been replicated 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 times, and maybe I'll say, okay, that seems to make sense. But usually what we have is this person went out, it was in a university context, they took 20 university students, they did a little thing, they published a paper, and they wrote it in a way that it got big headlines, and great, and that's the world. Don't put faith in research. Look at it, look at it, but don't say because there is research that something is true. Please don't do that.
Okay, interesting. I think there are several researchers here in the audience. I'm very interested in how they think. Zach, for example, and then Stephen. Can you go?
I would agree that you'd have to look at research very carefully. In the case of John Hattie, he did 800 meta-analyses. So he analyzed 800 different collections of research, and he sort of tried to find patterns, and he found indications. So in that case, I find it.
You know, Hattie's an interesting case because he's a very serious researcher, and he does a lot of these things, and I would have to look at every point in the. So I'm not putting Hattie down at all, and I don't know. You know, even in this particular case, we'd have to see what he says and what I think. My larger point is just that a lot of things, and just think about it. Think of all the things that we thought about the brain 20 years ago. Research told us that we never grew new brain cells. Research told us that the glial cells were of no use. Research told us, and so, yeah, but now new research tells us something completely opposite. So let's be really careful. Let's look at what we think and is the right thing, and it can steer us in very interesting directions, but let's corroborate and let's stay current.
Okay, Stephen.
So we have to think critically.
Two, yes.
Okay, so I actually have researcher as a job title, and my formal education was in researching about scientific discovery and research. So. And interestingly, I think Marc is mostly correct here. If you look at the Hattie stuff, you look at similar sort of research from Kirshner, Sweller, and Clark, and Dan Willingham in the United States. Content is what you have to have first. This research is based on results that measure somebody's success on content-based tests after. It is not demonstrated that somebody has learned. It is demonstrated that somebody has been able to answer that test question more accurately in this case than in that case. And that brings me back to what Marc was saying about accomplishment. Now, I'm not completely sold. I think achievement, as you've defined it, is significant as well and equally important for reasons we could talk about in another circumstance. But I do think that the presentation of accomplishment as an outcome of education as compared to, shall we say, test results, which is what the research is measuring, offers a different and alternative account. And I'd be curious to know what that would look like as a measurement of academic achievement, to use that word again. And then finally, to tie that back into critical thinking, I think there is such a thing as critical thinking. You can think correctly or incorrectly, but that definition also has changed over the years, which figures. And a lot of what is called critical thinking in the literature today is actually really very poor critical thinking. So that's all I have to say. Okay. Oh, one more thing. This has been a great discussion. Thank you for this.
Okay. Do you want to reflect on what Stephen said about the achievement?
Well, I don't disagree either. One of the interesting things to me is that in some ways, we really struggle to measure achievement and ranking. Ranking is one of the most difficult things there is to do in the world. It's almost impossible to do it accurately, and it's very destructive because people put themselves into competing. I even say ranking kills because in Palo Alto, kids throw themselves under trains. So contrasting with that, achievement, getting projects done in the way that they were, with the criteria that they were defined to have at the beginning, is very easily measurable. They're either done or they're not. And sometimes there's some gray areas.
It's not that easy.
It is that easy.
Well, I think one of the things that we haven't discussed here, which I feel the need to bring up, is that we have a lot of students at my institution, you know. The education system is based on there being more students than teachers. A lot of what we have to do and the way we have to do things is because of that. And we can have lovely discussions in this kind of utopian way about the perfect way that the education system might work. But a lot of those discussions seem to assume that there's an unlimited amount of teachers, that it's almost like one-to-one. I think where it gets really tough, just on a practical day-to-day basis, is where you're running a course where there's one teacher for 30 students, 40 students, and it's possible to do all of the things, the nice things that we've been talking about, but it's difficult. And I'd like to imagine that the way that we use digital could help us to deal with that in a really constructive way. Mainly what I see the digital used in the education sector is a way of just making that ratio bigger, you know, rather than actually making the teaching and learning process better. And that really worries me, and that's one of the things that makes me nervous about being an educator. Do you know what I mean? Because it feels like digital's taking us that way, not the other way. So that's just me waving a flag for the embattled teacher.
Well, I'm going to partially agree with you here because I think that one of the things that educational technology has done, and I'm not a fan of educational technology, I think one of the things it's done is just prolong the old system. And so it says, okay, yes, we could teach 40 now, we can teach 80 now, we can teach a MOOC of hundreds of thousands of whatever it is. But I don't agree that even though we're constrained and that one-to-one or close to one-to-one, pretty much everybody agrees would be a better system if we could afford it. Yeah. We're constrained financially. It's easier, I think, for a teacher who's got the right mindset to go around and supervise 4 teams or 5 teams of 5 people each, or 6 teams of 5 people each who are working on a project, than it is to try to stand up in the front and get everybody to the same place in the old manner that we do it. And it's certainly easier for me because I've done both. And so one of the model that we have of the teaching, and I'm the teacher for everybody in this room, that's a hard one because if I have to get to every single one of you individually, I don't have time in my hour. But if I put you into groups that had, you know, that were a reasonable number, that had reasonable objectives, and I came around and coached you and worked with you, I could do a whole lot more different things in that same hour.
If you look at a system for higher education for the future, for example, for the digital world, what would be the 3 most important aspects of this such a system for the future? What do you think? What would be?
It facilitates people getting together in groups. It facilitates groups getting things done, and it facilitates sharing of how that was done. So if we could do those 3 things, a sharing of the products and how to do that, so there's some continuous improvement in the system, that's off the top of my head, but I'd be happy.
Okay, and you, Mark? Dave, sorry.
It's okay, very easy to mix up. This is interesting to me because the fact is that people still want to come to university, they still want a degree, they still want a master's. So I think the really difficult part of it is that people demand to be ranked. And there's a tension between what you're talking about and the systems that you need to actually award degrees, okay? So I think that that is something that we need to consider, we need to break up. What I find is that students demand a fair and equitable environment, and institutions can be quite good at providing that, but it creates a lot of machinery and a lot of structure, and sometimes we get bogged down in that. So my answer really is, what I'm interested in is the sweet spot between the network and the hierarchy, okay? So the institution is largely hierarchical by its very nature. That has some really positive aspects to it, because if you have like a morally responsible institution, then that helps to create an equitable environment. The network is much more responsive, much more agile. It's a good place for becoming. And I feel like part of my role and what I'm interested in is where's, in the Venn diagram of the network and the hierarchy, where's the crossover? How can we, what can we do with education? How can we support the people who teach? How can we support our students to operate in that sweet spot between network and hierarchy? Because to my mind, just one or the other doesn't work anymore.
Okay.
And can we replace hierarchy, which is often, my image of the hierarchy is you have one bird at the top, and then on another perch you have 2 birds, and then on another perch you have 4 birds, another perch you have 16 birds, and guess what's coming down from the birds and covering the people, especially at the bottom. That's, you know,
I think that's a very particular view of what I mean by hierarchy. I think what I mean is the mechanisms to, for example, give people who aren't starting in a privileged position the opportunity to progress. And I think you need structure for that. So, you know, all animals are born equal, but some are born more equal than others, right? That's the world we're in. And, you know, in the network, people who don't start privileged don't do well. And I feel like the education system and the structural aspects of the education system should be there to give people opportunities who don't start with privilege. But what I see in the network and sometimes in education is it's just a system that helps privileged people to become more privileged.
Okay. And that's a very interesting discussion, because I see the networks as being a place that has much less hierarchy, like, say, the United States was, at least at one time, versus Europe, which is very hierarchical in many of its structures. And I think that the balance works better when it moves in favor of the network. For the kind of equity you want. But I remember that there's a great saying, what's the difference between the sadist and the masochist? And the masochist says, beat me, and the sadist says, I won't. And that's kind of this ranking thing. I mean, it's, no matter how much people are demanding, you know, are masochistic for ranking, we've got to figure there are much better ways to get people to grow and be, and than the kind of ranking systems that we have. And I personally think we should do everything in our power to resist. I think when you have to evaluate, which is certainly a valid thing to do, there's 3 categories. You're either good enough, you're exceptional, or you haven't gotten there yet, and you need to keep going. I don't think we need more than that. And I think that, you know...
But that's the system we've got.
Well, that's part of the system. That's a system that I went through when I attended Harvard Business School. That's how we were graded. Most people in the world are graded 91, 92, 93, 94, and certainly my kid is. And
any sort of ranking is ranking. It doesn't matter what levels there are, or what... It's the same thing.
I disagree.
Okay, good. It's supposed to be a debate after all.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. Okay, you don't see that I have here a clock that is ticking, and the clock is saying that I have 1 minute and 30 seconds left. So we don't have time for teachers about the metaphors.
Oh, the metaphors.
But I think we discussed several interesting themes, and it's obvious that you partly agree and partly don't agree about several things. So I think that the discussion...
We don't entirely agree about the metaphors.
No, no, even that, no. And I think that the debate and the discussion will continue, and in my opinion, that is creating knowledge. So let's do that. I want to thank you, for both of you, for your contribution. I want to thank the audience for their contributions, and the fact that you stayed with us in this discussion. I hope you have still a last hour and a half good online Educa Berlin. There are sessions after this session. I hope that the exhibitors still are there and not cleaning up already. And maybe we see each other next year. So thank you very much.
And speaking of network, okay.